Duelists stand as some of the most unyielding characters in the game. These duelists are gladiators who took part in brutal, ritualistic fights to the death in the once great Colosseums, but were driven out for an unknown reason. We speculate that it was simply an end to an era after the significant lore events took place following the initial death of Hoarah. Some speculate that these duelists are cursed, forever plagued to walk the lands between in an endless search for worthy opponents. We can't be sure, but this would certainly explain their scattered and isolated existence. Their armor is adorned with snakes, which is viewed as traitorous to the Erd Tree, and the Colosseum's audience was delighted to see these effigies beaten and battered for their amusement. Altering the cloak reveals a coiling snake that wraps itself around your arms, further mocking the Erd Tree. This is taken a step further, as by simply displaying the coiled snake armor renders you a target, attracting enemies' aggression much like Shiburi's woe. Rotten Duelists have had their armor and weapons eaten through by scarlet rot. We can note that from the ritual sword talisman, these arenas where ritual combat took place predated the era of Radagon. This simply implies that these duelists may have bore the adorned snakes prior to Rykard, or perhaps around the same time as his blasphemy. What is interesting is that the armor is titled with Gravekeeper, and you often find these duelists guarding grave sites. The term Gravekeeper often refers to a person who is responsible for maintaining grave sites. However, we had an alternative prospect in mind. We speculate that after the events involving the Rune of Death, some duelists guard grave sites to keep those that are buried dead. An interesting interaction we've observed is that when being grabbed by Rotten Duelists specifically, a snake appears out of their hands and bites you, infesting you with scarlet rot, an interaction that only occurs with the Rotten variants. Rotten Duelist armor is almost entirely obtained late game in the frozen lands of the consecrated snowfield. The Greaves and Great Axe can be found by killing a Rotten Duelist just northwest of Ordina. The Rotten Duelist found northwest from the consecrated snowfield site of Grace drops the Duelist helm and the battle hammer. The cloak, which is probably the most difficult to obtain, can be dropped from the dungeon boss of the consecrated snowfield catacombs. The armor itself is not particularly strong, and if it wasn't enough, the set also lacks gauntlets. We have two build variants for the Rotten Duelist today, one of which is one of the most fun I've had in Elden Ring so far. First up, we have the Great Axe build. This weapon stands out from many other colossal weapons since it scales more with dex than with strength. But like most weapons, the attack rating will be highest with dex and strength maxed and set to the quality affinity. This hefty weapon can be paired with poison so that it inflicts poison and scarlet rot simultaneously. Pair this with the Kindred of Rot's exaltation and you've got some epic damage with amazing poise break. However, we prefer to allocate our attributes to dex and int so that we can set the affinity to cold to take advantage of frostbite. Once frostbite builds up, the opponent will suffer 10% of its max health plus 30 flat damage, 7% for bosses though. Frostbite is exceptional in New Game Plus since enemies have increasing health, rendering frostbite a stronger option than poison since its usefulness does not really deteriorate. What's even better is that after frostbite builds up, the opponent takes 20% more damage from your attacks for 30 seconds. After this effect wears off, you can simply set off another frostbite for another round of potent burst damage. For the Ash of War, there are several options that we like, Lion's Claw being our favorite, which can be obtained by killing the Lion Guardian in Fort Gale. This ability looks epic, deals devastating blows, and staggers your opponents with massive stance damage. We use Shard of Alexander, Millicent's Prosthesis, Green Turtle Talisman, and the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman with the Stone Barb Cracked here in our Physic for extra stance damage. The next build is not just about the looks, even though it may seem that way. This build was so much fun the first time I did a playthrough with it that I found myself returning to it quite often, and I'm very excited to show you. We're going to be dual wielding the Rotten Battle Hammers, setting the main hand to Cold Affinity with Bloodhound Step, and the offhand with any Ash of War that you want with Blood Affinity. To maximize this build, you need some crazy high level stats, but it is potent nevertheless, even at a lower level. When maxed out, I have 3 stats focused: Strength, Arcane, and Intelligence. However, you really only need Strength and Arcane for this to shine. The Arcane scaling will assist with bleed buildup and the attack power scaling from that affinity, but regardless of your Arcane, bleed procs deal 8% of your opponent's health. The combination of successive attacks, bleed procs, and frostbite stack up to devastate even the most challenging bosses. Bloodhound Step with the follow-up attack will be your bread and butter for this build. The distance traveled is further than rolls and has more iframes than rolling.
This means that the more challenging mechanics can be easier to avoid. Iframes, for those who do not know, are the number of frames where you can be invincible during an action. Bloodhound Step costs a small amount of FP and about as much stamina as a roll, and can be performed even without FP. However, doing this will increase the stamina cost and lower the iframes significantly. So once you're out of FP, I would recommend just going back to rolling. This ability changes the gameplay greatly, and though it may take a second to get used to, it's so satisfying to jet around with dual battle hammers. The Stone Barb crack tier and the Thorny crack tier combo in your physic is our go-to for bosses, and for talismans we stuck with Rotten Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prosthesis,
and the other 2 slots can be filled with any of these excellent choices. Choose the second 2 talismans based on whether your opponent has resistances to effects such as Bleed or Scarlet Rot.
We appreciate you checking out another one of our NPC build guides, and if you have any requests for future guides or videos, shoot us a comment below. For more things Elden Ring, consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching.